Hey friends, welcome to Unpolished by Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. So today we're stepping into a conversation that feels a little quieter on the surface, but it runs deep once we start noticing it. Because most of us, if we've been around faith for any length of time, have picked up phrases along the way that sound reassuring, wise, sound like they belong in the language of belief. They get repeated so often, they start to feel almost like background music, familiar enough that we don't really question them anymore. And usually, nobody is trying to mislead anyone when these things get said. So most of the time, they come from a good place. Someone wants to comfort us. They want to help make sense of something painful or confusing. Sometimes we even say them to ourselves because they give us a sense of order when life feels unpredictable. But familiarity has a way of settling into our thinking, and over time, certain ideas can start shaping how we see God without us even realizing it. That's what we're exploring today. Not in a way that's harsh or combative, but in a way that's curious and honest, because discernment doesn't mean becoming critical of everything. It just means we're paying attention to what we've absorbed and asking whether it reflects the bigger, fuller story of who God actually is. And the interesting thing is that when we start doing this, we often discover that letting go of simplified ideas doesn't make faith weaker. It makes it steadier, because we're no longer leaning on phrases that only hold up in certain circumstances. We're learning to trust a deeper understanding, one that can hold both comfort and complexity at the same time. So today, we're talking about the ideas that sound spiritual, but don't always tell the whole truth. Where they come from, why they feel so reassuring, and what happens when we begin to see them through a clearer lens. So there's something deeply human about wanting life to make sense. When things unfold in ways we expect, we rarely stop to analyze them. But when something disrupts our expectations, when life veers into uncertainty or pain, confusion, we feel this immediate pull toward explanation. We want to understand what's happening and why. We want to believe that there's a framework that can hold the experience so it doesn't feel random or chaotic. Meaning gives us a sense of stability. And when we don't have it, the ground can feel like it's shifting under our feet. In faith, that instinct doesn't disappear. If anything, it intensifies. Because when we believe that God is present and involved in our lives, we naturally try to interpret events through that lens. We look for purpose, connection. We look for the thread that ties what we're experiencing to something larger than the moment itself. And that's not a weakness. It's part of how we engage with belief. We're trying to integrate our experience with our understanding of who God is. But here's where things get subtle. When we don't have clear answers, we often fill the gap with language that feels reassuring. Not because we're trying to be careless with truth, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable. And comforting language softens that discomfort. It gives us something to hold on to when the situation itself feels hard to grasp. Over time, those pieces of language can become almost automatic. Phrases we reach for without thinking. ideas that feel like part of the fabric of faith simply because they've been repeated so often. Most of us don't remember the first time we heard them. They just exist in the background, like familiar melodies we've always known. And because they're tied to moments of care, someone tried to comfort us, someone tried to offer hope, they carry emotional weight. They don't just sound spiritual, they feel compassionate, kind. They feel like they belong in the conversation when life gets complicated. And yet, familiarity has a way of slipping past our filters. See, when something feels familiar, we rarely stop to examine it. We assume it's trustworthy because it's common. But common doesn't always mean accurate. Sometimes it just means widely accepted. And that's where discernment begins. Not by assuming something is wrong, but by asking whether what's familiar is also faithful to the bigger picture of who God reveals himself to be. Another layer to this is the way community shapes belief. None of us come to faith in a vacuum. We inherit language, perspective, and interpretations from the people and spaces around us. That's part of what makes faith communal instead of purely individual. But it also means that some of what we absorb is cultural as much as it is biblical. Ideas get passed along because they resonate emotionally or because they're easy to repeat, not necessarily because they've been deeply examined. There's also the emotional economy of conversation to consider. When someone is hurting, we often feel a sense of urgency to say something that helps. Silence can feel inadequate. We want to offer reassurance, to communicate care, to make the situation feel less heavy. And in those moments, simple explanations can feel like a gift. They provide a sense of closure, even if that closure is temporary. They give us a way to respond when we don't know what to say. But over time, those explanations can start to shape expectations. If we consistently hear that there's a neat reason behind every hardship, we may begin to assume that faith should always provide clarity. If we're told that certain outcomes are directly tied to our level of belief, we may begin to measure our spiritual life against circumstances. And when reality doesn't align with those expectations, confusion can creep in. We might feel like we're missing something, we're doing something wrong, when in fact, the issue may be the framework itself. It's also worth noticing how much we're drawn to ideas that make faith feel controllable. If there's a formula, if there's a clear cause and effect, and there's a way to ensure certain outcomes, it can feel safer. Predictability gives us a sense of agency, but faith, at its core, is relational, not mechanical. It doesn't operate like a system where the right inputs guarantee the right outputs. And when we try to treat it that way, we can end up carrying expectations that were never meant to define our relationship with God. At the same time, these ideas persist because they often contain a sliver of truth. That's what makes them compelling. They're not fabricated out of nothing. They usually echo a real aspect of God's character or a genuine biblical principle, but they compress it into something simpler than it was meant to be. And when truth gets compressed, it can lose some of its depth. It can still comfort, but it may not sustain us when life becomes more complex. Think about how different it feels to sit with a mystery instead of rushing to resolve it. Mystery can feel uncomfortable because it reminds us that we don't control everything. But it can also deepen trust because it shifts our focus from understanding every detail to trusting the character of God even when details remain unclear. And that kind of trust is quieter, but often more durable. It doesn't depend on having all the answers. And this is why discernment isn't about dismantling comfort. It's about refining it. It's about allowing our understanding to grow so that the comfort we hold onto is rooted in truth rather than in simplification. It's about letting Scripture expand our perspective instead of confining our faith to the phrases we've heard the most. And there's a gentleness in this process. We don't have to approach it with suspicion or defensiveness. We can approach it with curiosity. We can acknowledge that we've all learned or leaned on ideas that felt reassuring at the time. That doesn't make us naive, it makes us human. The goal isn't to feel embarrassed about what we once believed. It's to keep growing in clarity as we continue walking with God. As we begin to notice these patterns, something shifts internally. We become less anxious about having perfect explanations. We become more comfortable saying, I don't know, without feeling like that undermines our faith. We learn that faith isn't weakened by honesty. If anything, honesty strengthens it because it allows us to engage with God as we actually are, not as we think we're supposed to be. And over time, this leads to a more resilient kind of belief, one that doesn't collapse when life doesn't fit into neat categories, one that can hold joy and grief, certainty and doubt, clarity and mystery, without feeling like it has to resolve every tension immediately. And that resilience comes from anchoring our understanding in God's character, rather than in the shorthand explanations we've inherited. When we step back and look at the bigger picture, we can see that this process is less about losing something and more about gaining depth. We're not abandoning comfort. We're allowing it to become more substantial. We're not rejecting faith. We're letting it mature beyond the need for easy answers. And that maturity creates space for a relationship with God that feels both more honest and more steady, because it's grounded in who He is rather than in how neatly we can interpret our experiences. So, as we move into the next part of this conversation, let's not go with defensiveness or skepticism, just openness. Because when we examine the phrases we've absorbed through that lens, we're not just analyzing language, we're allowing our understanding of God to become clearer, more nuanced, and ultimately more freeing. Once we begin to notice how these comforting ideas take root, how they grow out of our desire for reassurance, clarity, or a sense of order, it becomes easier to look at them without defensiveness. You don't have to treat them like enemies of faith. They're usually attempts at comfort, meaning, hope. But when we hold them up next to the broader story of Scripture, we start to see where they fall short of the fuller picture of who God is and how He actually meets us in real life. So take the idea that God won't give us more than we can handle. It's one of those phrases that sounds protective, almost like a promise of manageable circumstances. It suggests there's a ceiling to our suffering, a built-in safeguard that keeps life from ever exceeding our personal capacity. And in moments when things feel heavy, it can feel comforting to imagine that we're never carrying more than we're equipped to bear. But when we step back and look honestly at our own lives and at the stories we see throughout Scripture, we realize that life often does exceed what we can handle on our own. There are seasons that stretch us beyond our strength, understanding, our emotional capacity. And rather than those seasons being evidence that something has gone wrong, they often become the very places where we experience God's presence most clearly. Not because we're strong enough, but because we're not. When we cling to the simpler version of this idea, it can quietly create pressure. If life feels overwhelming, we might assume we're failing somehow, like we're supposed to be stronger or more composed. But when we release the assumption that faith guarantees manageability, we discover a deeper reassurance. Not that we'll always feel capable, but that we're never alone in what feels beyond us. And that shift moves the focus from our strength to God's faithfulness, which is a much steadier foundation. Then there's the idea that everything happens for a reason. It's a phrase that often comes from a sincere desire to find purpose in pain. We want to believe that nothing is wasted, that every experience fits into a larger plan. And while it's true that God can bring redemption and growth out of difficult circumstances, the phrase itself can sometimes oversimplify the reality of suffering. Not every hardship arrives with a clear explanation attached. Not every loss comes with a lesson we can easily identify. When we feel pressure to find the reason behind every experience, it can create a quiet burden. We might feel like we're supposed to interpret our pain correctly, like we're missing something if we can't make sense of it. But Scripture doesn't always present life as a puzzle we're meant to solve. It often presents faith as a relationship we're invited to trust, even when the reasons remain unclear. And that distinction matters because it frees us from the expectation that clarity must come before peace. Another idea that subtly shapes how we see faith is the notion that if we had more faith, certain struggles wouldn't exist. It can show up in small ways, sometimes in how we talk to ourselves. We might assume that difficulty is evidence of spiritual weakness, that strong faith should look like constant confidence or uninterrupted peace. But when we look at the broader narrative of faith, we see that struggle isn't the opposite of faith. It's often the context in which faith grows. The people we read about in Scripture experienced doubt, fear, waiting, uncertainty. Their faith wasn't defined by the absence of hardship, but by their willingness to keep trusting in the middle of it. And when we let go of the assumption that strong faith eliminates struggle, we make space for a more honest, spiritual life. We stop measuring ourselves against unrealistic expectations and start recognizing that faithfulness often looks like perseverance rather than perfection. As we begin to see these ideas more clearly, something shifts internally. We realize that the comfort they offered was often rooted in simplification rather than depth. And when we allow Scripture to expand our understanding, we don't lose comfort. We gain a sturdier version of it, one that doesn't depend on tidy explanations or predictable outcomes, but on the consistent character of God. This process also reshapes how we show up for others. When we're less attached to quick explanations, we become more comfortable offering presence instead of answers. We learn that sitting with someone in their pain without trying to interpret it can be a profound expression of love. We discover that faith isn't always about explaining what's happening. Sometimes it's about embodying compassion in the middle of it. Over time, this deeper discernment changes the way we talk about God altogether. Our language becomes less about formulas and more about relationship. We become less interested in neat conclusions and more interested in faithful presence. And that shift reflects a kind of maturity. Not because we have all the answers, but because we're comfortable trusting God even when answers remain incomplete. There's also a quiet freedom that comes with letting go of ideas that no longer serve us. It's the freedom to experience faith without the pressure of constant interpretation. The freedom to acknowledge mystery without feeling like it undermines belief. The freedom to trust that God's work in our lives isn't dependent on our ability to explain it perfectly. So when we look back, we often realize that releasing certain assumptions didn't make faith feel smaller. It made it feel more expansive, grounded, capable of holding the complexity of real life. And that kind of faith isn't fragile because it isn't built on slogans. It's built on trust, relationship, on the steady understanding that God's presence isn't contingent on how neatly our experiences fit into explanations. So discernment, at its heart, isn't about stripping away comfort. It's about allowing comfort to deepen. It's about moving from ideas that soothe temporarily to truth that sustains us over time. And that shift doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually as we continue walking with God and allowing our understanding to grow alongside our experience. So, friends, if this conversation stirred something in you, maybe a phrase you've heard countless times, maybe an idea you've quietly leaned on, that's not something to be afraid of. It's simply part of faith growing deeper, a learning to see more clearly. Discernment isn't about becoming critical, rooted. It's about letting our understanding be shaped by truth rather than just familiarity. And the beautiful thing is that as we let go of simplified ideas, we often discover a richer kind of comfort, one that doesn't depend on perfect explanation, but on the steady character of God. A comfort that holds up not only in the moments of ease, but in the complexity of real life. If you want to keep exploring, everything connected to the space lives in the show notes. The resources, the Start Here guide, the books, even the next steps if you want to go deeper. That's where the whole ecosystem lives, ready whenever you are. Thanks for being part of this conversation, and we'll talk again soon.